Hello guys, I am back with part 2 of Ejaz Ahmed's essay The Politics of Literary Postcoloniality. I am hoping that you watched the previous video and that the ideas are relatively clear. And for a broad revision, for a broad overview of the last essay, I would like to tell you that Ejaz Ahmed picked one of Spivak's passages and he critiqued them. He critiqued the passage, and in the passage his main contention was that if Spivak asserts that colonialism has left some sort of heritage, some sort of legacy for colonized countries like India, then her ideas are utterly misplaced, and that the only heritage and only legacy that colonialism has left in India is that of a painful partition of bad memories. Rest of the structures like democracy, like nationhood, like constitutionality, like socialism, culturalism, Ahmed maintains that either India already had a historically adequate referent for these concepts, or if we developed something after colonialism or during the decolonization, we developed it on our own through our struggle rather than someone leaving any heritage to us. That was his main contention with Spivak. He now moves on from critiquing Spivak's passage to focus on the term post-coloniality and how it has moved on from the previous debate in the 1970s and how it has developed into a term that's too wide, too vague, so vast that it means almost nothing, too postmodern, too elite, and also that this term has certain problems, and what problems this term has and the use of this term has is what we are going to cover in this part. I want you to remember three main points that we covered in the last lecture, which will be quite useful to understand this one as well. And you must be remembering it by now because I have repeated it quite a few times. So number one, the first debate on post-colonialism happened in which year? 1970s. In 1970s, a debate took place. The second wave of this post-colonial theory came in 1990s. Just remember that. Ahmed is not happy with the way this theory, when it is resurfacing in 1990s, it's not even making the mention of that previous debate that happened in the 1970s. That's first point. Second, the first wave, the first surfacing of the term post-colonialism happened not in the field of literary theory, not in the field of literature, did not stand for a group of intellectuals. It happened in the field of political science, in the field of political history, in the field of political theory. This is the second point that you should remember. Third, the governing framework for the debate in the 1970s was third world nationalism and not some sort of Western elitist postmodernism. In the 1990s, it was governed by postmodernism, which is a Western heritage. And what are the problems with using postmodernism as a governing framework to analyze what's happening in countries that have been dominated by imperial powers is the third point. Third point is that the governing framework was third world nationalism in the first go in the 1970s, but in the 1990s somehow it has shifted from third world nationalism to postmodernism, and what are the problems associated with it we are going to study in this section. All right, so these are the things that you have to recapitulate to start understanding what this passage is this part of this essay is going to tell you. Okay. So, with this I come back to the text. Let's start reading. Ahmed says, but why should the term post-coloniality carry the burden of such meanings? With this question, I should like to turn away from Spivak's definitional passage and address the broader question of the very status of this term. All right, as I told you that he is now going to focus on the status of the term. And he says, what I want to recall again is that the same thing that I told you, that the first major debate on the idea of post-colonialism took place not during the past few years but some years earlier, and that not in cultural theory but in political theory. That's the second thing that I told you. With the object of inquiry at that time not being post-colonial literature or post-colonial intellectual, but at that time in the 1970s, the focus of that debate was post-colonial state. That debate was initiated with Hamza Alvi's article, and respondents included Sherry Gerling, Mallory Pompermeyer, Emanuel Wallerstein, John Saul, Zeman and Lanzerdorfer. Have you even heard any of these names? And that's what he wants to tell you, that you will never hear of Hamza Alvi in our literary departments. You'll never hear of all these people who responded to his article written in 1975 about Pakistan and Bangladesh and the colonial problems. So you will never hear of these people because in the debate that took place in the relevance of our generation, these people are no more recalled. Their names are nowhere for us. And even Ejaz Ahmed published an article in 1985, but we do not hear of it too much because we have shifted our focus from political science, political history, political theory, and post-colonialism has totally become a niche of the literary theory area. All right. So this was some 13 years earlier after Alvi's original piece, but well before the term resurfaced in literary theory, without even the trace of that earlier debate, but with the radically altered and deliberately obscured. Please, you may underline this, that this time the debate has been radically altered and deliberately obscured, with a deliberately obscured meaning of the term itself. This is not the place to recapitulate that debate, so he cannot recapitulate that debate, but I did refer to it obliquely in a recent book of mine. The book is In Theory, about which I told you in the previous lecture, and he's citing a paragraph from the book, and in the book itself and here also he's now recounting the problems of how the term post-colonial was being used in 1970s and how its alteration, its radical alteration has led to a deliberate obscurity, a deliberate complexity, a complication of the term which is willful. So first I am going to come back to this paragraph and see if there's something that needs explanation here. Yeah, so he's almost recounting the first 3 points that I just mentioned, that it took place in the 70s and in 19s there was no mention of the previous debate. And second, this time it resurfaced in the field of literary theory, cultural theory, and in the first go it was political theory, political science. It's all repetition of the 3 facts that I mentioned in the beginning of this essay, that's all. And with this we move on to the next passage that he has quoted from his book In Theory. I am reading now. These terms, colonial and post-colonial, are key analytic categories which are used for periodization of history as regards the rule over peoples of particular countries by ruling classes of other countries. It stands for the fundamental shifts that take place with decolonization in forms of state and relations between different national formations, units of capital, classes and economies, for the internal reorganization of state personnel, modes of governance and appropriation as well as circulation of surpluses nationally and internationally, when sovereign regimes are constituted in former colonies. This analytic distinction rests upon the fundamental fact that the ruling class of a colony is located outside the colony and that the colonial state is the instrument of that externally based ruling class. With decolonization, the structural feature of the dominated formation no longer applies and the formation therefore ceases to be colonial, regardless of any other kind of dependence. In Marxist thought, these categories have a precise meaning because they refer not to the date of decolonization but to identifiable structural shifts in state and society and in the hierarchy of systemic determinations which structure the relations between the imperialist bourgeoisie and the direct producers of the imperialized but sovereign nation state in the territory that was previously a colony. So, the debate that took place in 1970s was quite relevant to the Marxist thought. At that point of time, as he mentions in this passage, the term post-colonial and post-colonialism stood not for a particular date, that after this date it became post-colonial. It wasn't that. It was the structural shifts that was taking place in countries that have been recently decolonized. What happens when the colonizer moves out? How the colonizer moves out, and what are the changes that take place in a country that has been recently made independent, that has recently gained its independence, I should say. All right. So, let's take a look at this passage line by line. I am going to just simplify things for you. He says that the term colonial and post-colonial are critical categories which are used for periodization. Okay, all right, it's used for periodization, but that periodization is not based on some date. It's based on, it stood for the fundamental shifts, the major changes that took place with decolonization. And what kind of changes took place with decolonization? Ejaz Ahmed mentions a couple of things that change when decolonization happens. The forms of state change. The relations between different national formations change. Units of capital, classes, economies, all these structures go through a change with decolonization. All right, so post-colonial and colonial stood for the shift that took place. The terms also stood for the internal reorganization of state personnel, modes of governance, and the way economic surplus was utilized nationally and internationally when colonized countries gained their independence. These are the things on which the definition of a time period as colonial or post-colonial depended. In the 70s, it depended upon a basic fact, and the fact was that the ruling class of a country, for example, Britain, which ruled India, was situated outside India, right? The colonial power which dominated a colony was situated outside India. And pay attention to this fact, although right now it won't make much sense as to why he's mentioning it, but if we remember this, it will be easy for us to understand the rest of his argument. So he's telling you that Britain was situated outside India. A colonial dominating power is situated outside the ruling class is situated outside the country that has been colonized. Okay, and that the colonial state was an instrument of the ruling class for whatever reasons. Maybe they want cultural domination, maybe they want economic domination, they want physical expansion of their area, and they want to expand markets. All of these things that they want, the colonial state becomes an instrument of that ruling class, and these were the basic tenets on which the debate in 1970s was focused on. But with decolonization, as you know, that once decolonization happens, this feature changes. The colonizer leaves. The country is no more colonized. Once the British left, India was no more colonized. All right. So Ahmed argues that in Marxist terms, the terms colonial and post-colonial had a precise meaning. You could pin down what's a colonial structure, what's a colonial practice, and what's post-colonial. All right, because they refer not to a particular date, but to the changes in structures that took place and the changes in hierarchy that took place between different systems in the decolonized countries. Okay, so this is what this whole passage means. If you read it once again on your own with my commentary, I hope that you will understand it much better. With this, let's move on to the second part of this passage that he has quoted, and I'm reading. These categories have no analytic value nor any theoretical status when they are mobilized to homogenize very complex structures of intellectual productions or the trajectories and subjectivities of individual writers and critics or broad intellectual strata. For particular intellectuals or clusters of them, colonial cultural ambience can last far beyond the moment of decolonization. For others, rejection of cultural dominance of the colonizing country can take place, and often does take place, well before the actual dissolution of the colonial state. Careers of historians and teachers like Sushobhan Sarkar, sociologists like A.R. Desai, militants and intellectuals like E.M.S. Namboodiripad, not to speak of D.D. Kosambi, mathematicians, Sanskritists, anthropologist, historian of ancient India, span many years of both the colonial and the post-colonial periods, and none of them can be categorized as either colonial or post-colonial intellectual, either in terms of chronology or in terms of their attitude towards European ideas. So Ahmed goes on to state that if intellectuals begin to homogenize the post-colonial intellectuals, which they call themselves, like Bhabha Saeed and Spivak and others who are associated with them, when they begin to homogenize very complex structures of intellectual productions, of the complex factors which are at play in the production of knowledge, simply meaning that the situations under which new knowledge is produced, you can't homogenize those situations, and if you do, then you take out the analytical value of a certain term. Of terms like colonial and post-colonial, they lose their theoretical status, they lose their analytic value if critics start using these terms to homogenize complex structures. All right. So he moves on to tell you that intellectuals differ, they have different ideas. There are some intellectuals who think colonialism is still going on, right. So similarly he brings on some names like Sushobhan Sarkar and A.R. Desai and others, and he says that some of them, particular clusters of them, they think that colonial impact can last far beyond decolonization. Even after the British left, I don't think today you cannot feel the impact of that decolonization. Consciously or subconsciously, we do encounter the impacts of colonization of India. And there are other critics who believed that all right, so with decolonization, colonialism has ended. So critics may differ on this account, and these authors that he is mentioning, the people who are mathematicians, Sanskritists and historiographers and sociologists. So he mentions these people and he tells that the career of these people and many others like them, they have written both in the colonial and post-colonial periods, and even then, have you ever heard of these people as post-colonial thinkers, as colonial thinkers? We have never heard of them, because in the 90s, the major trend is to homogenize tendencies, is to highlight thinkers who homogenize, who categorize and try to group. You remember in the last part we read about how certain groups of writers are marketed as post-colonial writers. So certain writers, certain thinkers are marketed as post-colonial, and obviously these authors have not been marketed, so we've never heard of them. And how this was in the 1970s, these people, these debates were mentioned in the 70s and mentioned in the 80s, but in the latest debate about colonialism and post-colonialism, these people are nowhere present and they are never been termed as colonial or post-colonial thinkers, either in terms of chronology, that these people wrote before the decolonization, so these people are colonial, and these people wrote after the decolonization, so these people are post-colonial, either in terms of chronology or their attitude. Someone who writes from the colonial perspective may be termed as colonial, someone who writes from the perspective of the colonized may be termed as post-colonial, but these people, neither through their attitude nor in terms of chronology, were tagged as either colonialists or post-colonialists. All right. So this is what he has to say, and let's see how these passages are relevant to the subsequent arguments. Even if there are certain points that you don't agree with or you think that are complicated here, it will all make sense as you finish the lecture. Let's read ahead. I might add that my disagreements with Hamza Alvi, whose work I otherwise greatly admire, had been argued on very specific and quite different grounds. It is worth remarking, though, that in periodizing our history in the triadic terms of pre-colonial, colonial and post-colonial, the conceptual apparatus of post-colonial criticism privileges as primary the role of colonialism as the principle of structuration in that history. So that All that came before colonialism becomes its own prehistory, and whatever comes after can only be lived as an infinite aftermath. That may well be how it appears to those who look at that history from the outside. To those, in other words, who look at the former colonies in Asia and Africa from inside the advanced capitalist countries, but not to those who live inside that history. In India, for example, it is very difficult to treat the social and cultural consequences of colonialism as discrete and sui generis. In histories of gender and caste and class, the pre-colonial and the colonial, and now some half a century later the post-colonial, are too deeply intertwined for that sort of treatment. But then, there have been other countries such as Turkey, which has not been colonized, or Iran and Egypt, whose occupation had not led to colonization of the kind that India suffered, where the onset of capitalist modernity and their incorporation in the world capitalist system brought about state apparatuses as well as social and cultural configurations that were nevertheless remarkably similar to the ones in India, which was fully colonized. In this context, we should speak not so much of colonialism or post-colonialism, but of capitalist modernity, which takes the colonial form in particular places and at particular times. After all, the United States was also once a colony or a cluster of colonies. So was Latin America to the south of the US, Canada in the north, not to speak of the Caribbean islands. But later history has taken in each case a very different turn. When applied too widely, powerful terms of this kind simply lose their analytic power, becoming mere jargon. So now Ahmed comes to actually telling you what are the problems that are associated with using the term post-colonial so widely. So he says that if we term the periods in history merely as pre-colonial, colonial and post-colonial, we somehow privilege the role of colonialism as a grand factor that determines the structure of every society in every time of history. So that everything that comes before colonialism becomes its own prehistory, and everything that comes after it becomes its like infinite aftermath, the after effects that will last forever, a consequence that never ends. So in this formulation, colonialism emerges as this great, grander than anything power that has defined times before and after its coming. And do we really want that? To recognize times and places with such a framework that exploited so many on such a large scale, and especially for people from India? I guess not. But it may appear this way to some people. Ahmed says that it may appear to some people it may appear convenient for some people to term periods of history as pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial. And who are these people? Yes, you guessed it right. Ahmed is after the Holy Trinity of Said, Bhabha and Spivak, and these are the people. And he says you are situated in countries like Britain, America and France. These are the countries that colonized other countries. These are the advanced capitalist countries of the world. Situated in these countries, you are creating knowledge about countries that are facing the problem firsthand. So it may appear this way to you, but not to the people who are living inside that history within the countries that have been exploited by advanced capitalism. Now pay attention to how he does not say that it appears this way to people in the colonized countries. It does not appear to the people in the colonizing countries. He wants to dethrone, decenter the term colonialism as a factor to define historical periods, and he insists that it is advanced capitalism and not colonialism that is the defining feature when it comes to periodization in history. In fact, I'll take a detour and tell you, if you had to ask me about this essay and what it really means, I would say in one sentence that Ahmed wants to tell you that we shouldn't define societies, time periods and attitudes by making colonialism as our framework, but he says that it's all because of capitalist attitudes. He's a Marxist and he thinks that advanced capitalism, obviously, why did the British come to India? They wanted raw material, they wanted markets, and they wanted other economic advantages. So it is capitalism, it's the need for more and more economic advancement that brings countries to other countries and thus creates colonization. So he says that we should not make colonialism so grand that we decide everything according to it. It's easy for people who are situated in these capitalist countries, but not for the people who live that history. Alright. So he says why it can't be done. In India, for example, first of all, you cannot separate the social and cultural impact of colonization, can you? They are deeply intertwined. Also, it is difficult to separate the pre-colonial, colonial and post-colonial. This is also deeply embedded with each other. It is twisted in so many ways that it is very, very difficult to study, especially by people who are not even here to experience and see all of this firsthand. Alright, sitting in Britain and sitting in advanced capitalist countries, you are theorizing and producing knowledge about people and processes that are complex to comprehend and face even to those who suffer it firsthand. Alright. So now he brings the example of other countries that were never colonized and notices same features in their histories, which India was also facing, but Turkey was also facing. Turkey was never colonized. Iran or Egypt, they were dominated, but they were never physically colonized. There were never colonies in Egypt and colonies in Iran. So what he wants to tell you is that despite their difference in terms of colonization, all these countries, India, Turkey, Iran and Egypt, share the same, share some common social and cultural features remarkably similar to that of India. So he says, logically speaking, if we conclude from this, we should not treat colonization as the primary factor which structures social formations in countries, but the capitalist modernity that affected every country in a certain way at a certain time. Colonialism may be, I mean, this is my personal opinion and I hope that he's meaning to say the same. Colonialism may be understood as one of the consequences of advanced capitalism and not the primary force that created history and divided it into pre-colonial and colonial and post-colonial. If some theorists, some intellectuals do that, it's a folly, it's not the right thing to do for intellectuals. He says, look at how the USA, Latin America, the Caribbean islands and Canada and how the histories of all these countries took such different terms. Can you see that? US and Canada are in one league and Latin America and Caribbean are still somehow dominated, and we see that every day. So some became powerful imperial forces and some still continue to be dominated. So is it really colonization that matters? All the above four mentioned countries I just told you were colonized, but they took such different trajectories economically and politically. So was it really colonialism that mattered so much, or was it capitalist modernity that came to some acquired such powerful status in the world politics and some did not? Some still are dominated. So Ahmed demonstrates that it is capitalism and not colonialism that is the primary factor in the structuration of societies in various countries. He says and ends the paragraph by this assertion that when we apply terms like colonialism and post-colonialism too widely to so many things and so many phenomena and so many ideologies, they lose their power and end up as mere jargon which you don't understand. Okay? So with this paragraph has ended and I am moving on to the next one. As the terms post-colonial and post-colonialism resurfaced during the 1980s, this time in literary and cultural theories and in deconstructive forms of history writing, and as these terms were then conjoined with the newly coined post-coloniality, this resurfacing included no memory of how the term had come into being in the first place. In some usages, the word post-colonial still attempted a periodization so as to refer to that which came after colonialism, though this sense of periodization was itself used differently by different critics. But this word post-colonial was to be used increasingly not so much for periodization as for designated some kinds of literary and literary critical writings, and eventually some history writing as generically post-colonial, while other writings in those same domains of literature, literary criticism and history writing, presumably were not. So I guess this is fairly simple to understand. He once again complains that this time in the 80s, the debate did not make any mention of the debate in the 70s. This time it was all about writing, literature, literary theory, and some intellectuals. Although the features of the writings matched, they were similar, and yet some writings were included in the term, umbrella term post-coloniality, and some writings were not included in that term post-coloniality. All right. So basically the whole paragraph just makes the same point once again. And with this, let's move on further. This aggrandized sense of the term as connoting generic definitions of periods, authors and writings gathered force through a system of mutual citations and cross-referencing among a handful of influential writers and their associates. About Edward Said's sharp distinction between the so-called colonial and post-colonial intellectuals, I have written elsewhere at some length. Robert Young, who had until a decade ago devoted himself almost entirely to propagating French post-structuralism in the British Isles, with hardly a thought to spare for the erstwhile colonies, suddenly emerged as leading theorists of what got called post-colonial criticism, even though he hardly uses the term in his white mythologies. The book signifies his first major awakening to the fact of imperialism. But in a world already populated by post-structuralist thought and punctuated by those three masters of post-coloniality, Said, Bhabha and Spivak, to whom he devoted the last 3 chapters of the book. In turn, Gyan Prakash would then invoke Young's authority and that of the subalternist group in which Gayatri Spivak more or less belongs, in his own squabbles with David Washbrook. In another sort of inflation, Homi Bhabha would cite Jameson's magnificent reading of Lord Jim in the Post-Colonial Unconscious to declare that Jameson himself was practicing post-colonialism, which is probably news to Jameson himself, considering that Bhabha says on the previous page that the post-colonial perspective resists the attempt at holistic forms of social explanation. Also, so far as I know, Jameson has never broken with concepts of history and progress or with the further concepts of modes of production, whereas according to Gyan Prakash, the main virtue of post-colonial criticism is precisely that it has abandoned the nationalist ideas of history and reason as well as the modes of production meta-narratives of Marxism. Meanwhile, Bhabha's own book, Location of Culture, comes to us with handsome praise from Edward Said and Toni Morrison. So again, basically, one should be familiar with all these names, at least an introductory familiarity, to understand what point Ahmed is trying to make. Basically, he's trying to tell you that Said refers to Bhabha, Bhabha refers to Said, and Spivak refers to Bhabha and Said, and one praises the other praises back. So a cycle of citations and referencing and cross-referencing went on. And then there were associates like Robert Young, and then there was Gyan Prakash from the Subaltern Studies group. So what happened was that there were these 3 masters of post-coloniality, as Ahmed calls them, and you should remember, write that phrase in your essays and it will be really impactful. So there were these 3 masters of post-coloniality, and I must tell you that the 3 masters of post-coloniality, I hope you understand that it's been being used in quite a sarcastic way and not to praise these people. So what he means is that then there were associates like Robert Young and Gyan Prakash, who had, for Robert Young, he says that he didn't have any interest in post-colonialism a little while earlier, and now he is all post-colonial, and how, and I don't know, I mean, he isn't even from any country that was being colonized, or didn't even face any first-hand impacts of colonialism. Of course, he had the right to write it, but Ahmed maintains that it's only a system of referencing and cross-referencing in citations that gathered currency and made post-coloniality as an authoritative, as a real, as an actual thing. But there's one line that I need to simplify here, that in the last few lines, he says that Gyan Prakash, according to Gyan Prakash, the main virtue of post-colonial criticism is precisely that it has abandoned the nationalist ideas of history and reason, as well as the modes of production, meta-narratives of Marxism. So this is the strand of thought, the post-modernist abandonment of concepts like history, of nationalism, reason, Marxism. They take such pride in abandoning these narratives, these concepts, that it becomes more and more postmodern and less about third world nationalism, about the thing that it was about in the first place. All right. So basically this is what the whole passage means. I seriously request you to Google a little bit about Gyan Prakash, about David Washbrook, about how Frederick Jameson is being invoked here. Let's move on with the text now. But within the field of literature, we also have, alongside post-colonial criticism, the quite different category of post-colonial writing. This quite different and its own way quite common usage refers simply to literary compositions, plays, poems, fiction of non-white minorities located in Britain and North America, while efforts are now underway also to designate the contemporary literatures of Asia and Africa as post-colonial, and thus to make them available for being read according to the protocols that metropolitan criticism has developed for reading. I would suggest you to underline this phrase, protocols that metropolitan criticism. Here's where he's again referring to postmodernism, which is an elitist Western concept. And that is the protocol that metropolitan criticism has developed for reading what it calls minority literature. It is in this sense, and I'm reading, it is in this sense that some British universities seem to be institutionalizing that singular pedagogical object, which is variously called new literatures, emergent literatures, and post-colonial literatures. In some ways, this specific sense of post-colonial literature converges partly with the category of multiculturalism and minority literature, even third world literature, as these categories arose somewhat earlier, but then it also converges with the term others, as it was used in the phrase Europe and its others. In at least one of the many nuances, post-colonial is simply a polite way of saying not white, not Europe, or perhaps not Europe, but inside Europe. So now he comes to the field of literature. He says that besides the history and critical writing that called itself post-colonial, we had in the field of literature post-colonial writing. This usage included works of literature like plays, poetry, fiction. These works were composed by non-white minority people living in Britain and North America. All right, both advanced capitalists pay attention. So these people were the minority people living in the advanced capitalist countries. And at the time Ahmed was writing this essay in 1995, he says that efforts are on to include the literatures of Asia and Africa also, and we know that that really did happen. All right, Asia and Africa, the literatures from Asia and Africa are now considered as post-colonial literature. So all these literatures became available to be analyzed according to what I made you underline, according to the protocols of metropolitan criticism, which suggests subtly that it's postmodernism. Thus, by analyzing literature coming from non-white people and calling it minority literature, new literature, emergent literature, post-colonial literature, Ahmed suspects that how universities in Britain seem to be institutionalizing the works by third world people or colonized people and was making these people a singular object of study. Pay attention to the use of word object. If these people and their literature become object of study, then again it re-establishes Europe as the subject, which post-colonial studies have such a big problem with. So, all right. So, the terms are sometimes associated with multiculturalism, minority and third world, but more importantly, it also sometimes means others as Europe and its others, and you know how problematic this formulation of Europe and its others is. So, you see what happened. The term was eventually connoting the superior subject status of Europe and again colonialism. So, Ahmed contends that the word post-colonial sometimes comes to mean a polite way of saying not white, not Europe, or sometimes not Europe but inside Europe, minority literatures. The subject still remains Europe and the rest of the world still remains the other of Europe, and it is institutionalized through the use of the term post-colonial while analyzing these literatures coming from people who are not Europeans. All right. So, let's move ahead. Let me turn briefly though to the matter of the term's spatial and temporal applications. In usages spawned by such influential books as The Empire Writes Back, and especially in much writing emanating from Australia, the terms colonial and post-colonial are applied not just to what is generally called the Third World, but also to the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia itself, so that what remains to be done, I suppose, is to see how this singular thing, post-coloniality, functions in the United States and in Vietnam, both colonies of Europe at one time or another. This inclusion of countries like the United States among the post-colonies and the fixing of the beginning of post-colonialism with the first moment of colonizing itself serves, of course, to extend both the spatial and temporal scope of post-coloniality quite considerably. But I have seen articles in a great many places, including the special issue of Social Text on Post-Coloniality, which pushed the use of the term colonialism back to such configurations as the Incas, the Ottomans, and the Chinese well before the European colonial empires began, and then bring the term forward to cover all kinds of national oppressions, as, for example, the savagery of the Indonesian government in East Timor. Colonialism thus becomes a transhistorical thing, always present, always in the process of dissolution in one part of the world or another, so that everyone gets the privilege sooner or later, at one time or another, of being colonizer, colonized and post-colonial, sometimes all at once in the case of Australia, for example. So now he comes to how this term was applied in terms of space and time. The term post-colonial gained more and more currency, especially after the famous books like The Empire Writes Back by Bill Ashcroft and Griffiths and Tiffin. And you know, when we enter university departments or honors courses in literature, we are told to absolutely read The Empire Writes Back because it's considered, the go-to book of post-colonial theory. But what was peculiar in this was that in books like this and in more important works like other journals and other kind of writing, the term post-colonial was used for nations as diverse as the US and Australia, Canada and New Zealand, even the US and Vietnam. Also, this was about space, how such distant and also such historically and culturally distant and politically distant nations were placed together under the umbrella term of post-coloniality. Also, in terms of time, you remember the first moment of modern colonization being Columbus setting his foot in the Americas from maybe in 1492. So it's 15th century. So they stretched back the period of colonialism right from the colonization of the USA in 1492. And now when the essay is being written, it's 1980s, 1990s. So you see how long a period it covers in its ambit. So the term post-colonialism mean such a long period of time, such a wide variety of spaces, countries. And by doing this, they extended both the time period and space covered under the scope of post-coloniality. You should remember that he just told you that when you expand the scope of a term in this way, it loses its analytic value. So he mentioned seeing a whole issue of the journal, important journal, social text dedicated to post-coloniality, which tries to push the meaning of the term right from the Incas Empire. Right, the word is there in the paragraph, INCAS, Incas Empire. It was a pre-Columbian empire which had its origin somewhere in the 13th century. And later it was conquered by the Spanish in 1572. They also included the Ottoman Empire, which had its beginning in the 13th century, then had a long and complicated history of being a powerful empire lasting about 600 years, making conquests, expanding, later associating with other countries in wars, and then partition, and then eventual dissolution in 1923. Starting of the Ottoman Empire from 13th century to 1923 covers a very wide amount of time. Okay, so they included the Chinese, which we know have an immensely long history. All these configurations were in force even before the European Empire. So you see how wide a time they have incorporated when they use the term post-coloniality. What Ahmed is trying to convince you is that by including such histories, I'm sorry, and such immense geographical regions, don't you think that the attention is kind of diverted? The term post-colonial becomes more and more textual, less and less activist, less and less material. The attention is kind of diverted from the current problem at hand, the criticism of actual economical, cultural exploitation by Europe of countries that were hardly any agent in such colonization. Thus, the term post-coloniality, when understood by with the post-modernist stance, becomes almost something that is very wide, something that includes everything, with something so vague that it loses its value as an effective tool of activism. All right, the next lines are pretty simple, and I'm just going to read them for you to connect whatever I just said with the closing of this paragraph. Ahmed says, colonialism thus becomes a trans-historical thing. It's not about one period of history. It becomes trans-historical, always present, always in the process of making, remaking and dissolution, right, in one part of the other. Right, even today, can you say that no country is trying to dominate the other country in terms of geographical invasion? We can look at our own country at this particular point of time, and it's happening. Colonialism is still in process. Don't you think that there are countries that are trying to get decolonized? There are wars going on. There are people fighting for their independence. So decolonization is still going on. So Ahmed says that the condition of post-coloniality through postmodernism becomes elitist, it becomes vast and vague, and everybody gets the privilege in it sooner or later at one time or another of being colonizer, colonized and post-colonial. All right. So this was that. Now moving forward, the fundamental effect of constructing this globalized transhistoricity of colonialism is one of evacuating the very meaning of the word and dispersing that meaning so wide that we can no longer speak of determinate histories, of determinate structures, such as that of the post-colonial state. The role of the state in reformulating the compact between the imperialist and the national capitals, the new but nationally differentiated labor regimes, legislations, cultural complexes, etc. Instead, we have a globalized condition of post-coloniality that can be described by the post-colonial critic, but never fixed as a determinate structure of power against which determinate forms of struggle may be possible outside the domains of discourse and pedagogy. Given this dispersal of meaning by the very authors who use the term, it would appear more fruitful to ignore their mutual differences and to concentrate on the problems that arise from such deployments. So Ahmed obviously states that thus constructing a globalized transhistoricity of colonialism. What is globalized transhistoricity of colonialism? That colonialism is something that is global. Colonialism is something that is transhistoric, that goes from one era to the other and is all pervasive through time. The post-colonial theorists, what do? They suck the meaning out of the word and scatter it so wide that we can no longer focus on the determinate history of determinate structures of the post-colonial state. To study a country like India, the struggles they went through, how they got decolonized, how the structures after decolonization relate to each other, form hierarchies, form legislations, labor regimes, how they form cultural complexes, all this is set aside and it ends up being textual, being a discourse, being a pedagogy of how to teach post-colonialism rather than an actual material condition lived through and struggled against by the people colonized and dominated by definite power structures of advanced capitalism. The very authors who use this term play a role in dispersing the meaning of the term. When the Empire writes back and the social text, when authoritative books and journals and writings like this and critics like this use the term in such a wide meaning, it disperses the meaning of the term. And now Ahmed says that now, leaving aside the mutual differences between these theorists like Bhabha, Said and others, he goes on to explain the problems that arise by the use of the term post-coloniality. So now we come to the last para of this section and I am reading the text first. First, the field of application. Arif Dirlik is, I think, quite correct in pointing out that the term begins immediately to break down because it designates far too many things all at once. It is said to refer first to conditions that are said to prevail in the former colonies such as India, but the same term is also made to refer to a global condition of the relation between the West and the rest, whether or not any of the rest was actually colonized. So, the post-coloniality becomes a post not only of colonialism but also of an indeterminate larger thing. At the same time, the term post-colonial also comes to us as the name of a discourse about the condition of post-coloniality, so that certain kinds of critics are post-colonial and others not. Bhabha supremely so, and myself mercifully no, as Dirlik carefully points out. Following on which is the attendant assertion that only those critics who believe not only that colonialism has more or less ended, but who also subscribe to the idea of the end of Marxism, nationalism, collective historical subjects and revolutionary possibility as such are the true post-colonials, while the rest of us who do not quite accept this apocalyptic anti-Marxism are not post-colonial at all. In this formulation then, that which is designated as post-colonial discourse presumes the prior consent to theoretical post-modernity. I would like you to underline that there is a prior consent to theoretical post-modernity. Between post-coloniality as it exists in a former colony like India and post-coloniality as the condition of discourse practiced by such critics as Homi Bhabha, there would appear to be a very considerable gap. This gap, post-colonial theory seeks to fill by a remarkably circular logic. And what's the logic? We live in the post-colonial period, hence in a post-colonial world. But neither all intellectuals nor all discourses of this period and this world are post-colonial, because in order to be a properly post-colonial discourse, the discourse must be post-modern, mainly of the deconstructive kind, so that only those intellectuals can be truly post-colonial who are also post-modern. So this para kind of summarizes what Ahmed is trying to say all along. He says that as Arif Dirlik also agrees, that the term post-colonial and post-colonialism and post-coloniality, the term to break down as soon as you use them, because they mean so many things that the meaning runs into all directions, right? So what does it mean? What does the term post-coloniality has come to mean? Number one, according to Ahmed in the text. It refers to conditions that are said to prevail in the former colonies like India, as in the post-coloniality of India, but it also refers to a global relationship that exists between the West and the rest of the world. That is also post-colonialism, how the West relates to the rest. All right, it does not take into consideration whether the rest in question was ever colonized or not. It's still post-colonial because it has a relationship with the West. All right, so thus post-colonialism becomes not the post of not colonialism, but of something larger than colonialism, which is indeterminate. All right, no fixed meaning again. Secondly, it refers to the name of a discourse about a condition of post-coloniality, right? It's a discourse, something that is textual and discursive and not material. So a discourse, so that certain kinds of critics are post-colonial, like Bhabha and Spivak and Said, and others are not. Ahmed does not, no matter how effective he is against the issue of colonial domination, but he will not be included because he is not postmodern. He uses the framework of third world nationalism. With this use of the term post-colonial comes the assertion that, and it's very important, only an elite group of theorists who believe that colonialism has ended, and along with it has ended Marxism, along with it has ended nationalism, collective historical subjectivity, and all possibilities of a revolutionary struggles. All of this has ended. Only those critics who admit to this can be called post-colonial, while other critics who do not believe in the end of Marxism are excluded from this elite category. Obviously, there appears a gap between post-coloniality as it actually exists in the previously colonized countries like India, and the post-coloniality as a discourse, as a global discourse, trans-historical global discourse explained and argued like the theorists by Said, Bhabha and Spivak. This gap, these theorists seek to fill by a circular logic. What is the logic about who will become a post-colonial critic and who will not? So they say that we live in a post-colonial world, in a post-colonial period and a post-colonial world. But neither all intellectuals nor all discourses of this world are post-colonial. He just proved that in the previous passage. Because in order to be a properly post-colonial discourse, according to Ahmed, these theorists believe that the discourse must admit to an end of concepts like history, end of history, that is really popular, end of history, end of Marxism, which is a postmodern tendency. And so, for a discourse to be properly post-colonial, a critic must be postmodern, mainly who deconstructs concepts and challenges their existence. So he concluded, Ahmed concluded, that according to these so-called post-colonial theorists, only those critics are allowed to enter in that elite group who are postmodern in their inclination. And thus, the only theoretical discussion which was about the colonized nations, which was about the theory arising out of the colonized country, is institutionalized by Western theoretical models like postmodernism, and people living outside of colonized country end up theorizing about conditions that are inside the colonized countries, and thus post-coloniality becomes an unreal, a virtual, a kind of textual concept that does not apply to material things, cannot be defined, cannot be as such determined what it means, to whom it applies, and becomes so vague that it loses its effective analytical potential. So that's about the second part of the essay, and I hope it's clear. If it's not, I'll go for a quick revision. What happened in this essay was that he took up the word post-colonial and showed you how it has been stretched according to space and according to time, and how it follows postmodernist principles so closely and believes in end of history, end of Marxism, end of most theories, most theoretical frameworks, that it loses its effectivity, it loses its analytical capability, and ends up categorizing certain critics into as a group of post-colonial critics, and deliberately excludes those who do not admit to being postmodern, post-colonial critics. All right. So I hope this was helpful. If there's any issue, please don't hesitate to write in the comment box. I'll be more than happy to answer your queries. And finally, please consider liking the video and subscribing to this channel if you think these videos are helpful to people like you. Thanks a lot. Have a great day. Bye.